Welcome to this session on EU-India relations and its global implications. Let me also take the opportunity to congratulate and thank Samir Saran, my colleagues at ORF and the Ministry for External Affairs for another splendid Raisina dialogue, a really special one as it enters its 10th year. Now, in a remarkable poem published more than a century ago, W.B. Yeats had written clairvoyantly, "Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." But even in these times of doom and gloom, sometimes things don't go, after all, from bad to worse. Sometimes, some years, muscadel faces down frost, green thrives, the crops don't fail. Sometimes the center does hold. And it is a matter of great pleasure to me that we're doing a panel right now on the positive title of When the Center Holds, India-EU Partnership and Global Stability. Now, there are many reasons for the growing importance of the EU-India strategic partnership, not only for the parties involved, but also globally. And this well-established partnership took a turn for even greater strengthening with the recent visit of President Ursula von der Leyen and her entire College of Commissioners to India last month. The first such visit of the collective European leadership to India, and also the first for the Commission beyond the European continent as part of its new mandate. We have a very distinguished panel with us today, and they're going to help us think about both the opportunities, but also the challenges, the risks, and the pitfalls. So if I may, let me start with you, Minister Leyen. The EU-India partnership is one that has been on a solid footing for decades now, but it's also one where there has been considerable Luft nach oben, room for improvement. This is something that the European Parliament also acknowledged last year. So tell us, do you see any reasons to believe that there is going to be a fundamental change in momentum now?
Yes, I do. And I think the visit of the whole EU collegium, or as we might say more colloquial, the ministers of the EU, and their first trip outside of Europe to India, I think that's a very strong signal, a very strong testimony to the commitment of the EU and its member states to really deepening the relationships with India. And I think our heightened interest in fostering this relationship has very good reasons, because we know that looking around the world to developments coming from Russia, but also coming from the US, coming from China, we need to foster our relations with our value partners. And I think here we also have a strong common interest, India and the EU. And that interest is that we both know that we need to diversify our relationships, both politically, security, but also in the economic sense. I'll just give you one example. Currently in the EU, 95% of our solar cells are imported from China, just from one place, 95%. And we know that if we want to de-risk, we need to build up trading relationships, for instance, in solar cells with other trusted partners, such as India. I know that manufacturing plants for solar cells are just being built here now, and we would really encourage you to invest also in building up that capacity also for trading with the EU. And I think that maybe a final point to your first question, now we see also that the EU steps up its role also as a global actor. You know, I just came from Berlin yesterday, where we voted on a historic defense package. The EU has stepped up its activities in defense, but also in global engagement. And I think it would be good if our value partners such as India would join us in this cause and also step up engagement in multilateral fora, be it climate, be it other issues, so that we can achieve actually a stable multilateral framework so that we ensure that the center really holds.
Okay, thank you very much. Which leads me very nicely into my next question, which is to you, Secretary General Seyfioff. The EU is, as Minister Leyen just said, the EU is evolving into a geopolitical, geo-economic actor. Now, look back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and there was considerable, how should I put it, disappointment on the position that India was taking towards this conflict, this war. Tell us how you see the relationship of the Union, the European Union, with India today in that context of Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you, and first of all, I want to thank the organizers for the honor of including me on this distinguished panel. And I want to pick up right where my colleague and friend Anna Lyrman ended. The European Commission's visit to India was not just symbolism. It was a noteworthy gesture demonstrating Europe's commitment to this relationship. Now, a lot has been said during the past few days here on Europe and India sharing a lot. Democracy, obviously, but also I would suggest to you an interest in an international system that is predictable and stable and based upon agreed upon rules. We're both relatively big players, Europe and India, but we're both dependent upon a predictable international system. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me be very frank in order to save time. This system is not just under pressure, this system is under attack. It is under attack in Ukraine. The most basic of principles upon which the international system stands, the United Nations Charter, the notions of illegality of aggression, the concepts of territorial integrity and sovereignty, they are all under attack in Ukraine. Now, whether or not we succeed in defending an international system, whether or not we succeed in bringing about a just and lasting peace is yet to be seen. But there will be peace one day. Peace that will define the era to come after this war. Now, we cannot defend a rules-based international system unless we defend it where it's attacked. The system is being attacked in Ukraine, and that's why Europe is committed to a just and lasting peace as an outcome of this conflict. We all have different perspectives on international affairs, shaped by differences in size. Estonia is 1,000 times smaller than India is population-wise, differences in our history, certainly differences in our geography. We have different pasts, but ladies and gentlemen, we share a future. If we are to live in a world where territorial integrity and sovereignty are not rendered hollow, empty phrases in outdated treaties, then we need to defend this order now. We're not asking for anybody in the world to defend Europe's interests. We're asking countries to defend their own interests, their own stakes in this international order. This is Europe's plea. I'm happy to repeat it here today. We are not done. As Minister Leyen said, Europe is here. Europe has woken up. Europe is now back in business, and we intend to succeed.
Okay, thank you very much. Secretary Tanmeji, we heard from Anna Leyen the motivations to have a deepened cooperation with India on the part of Europe. Tell us, are there also new imperatives that are injecting a new drive for India towards the Union?
Sure. Thank you very much. Good to be here. If we look at the situation today, there is a whole transformation going on, not only within India and the European Union, individually, collectively, but also the entire global context. And if you just see today, collectively, the European Union is perhaps the second largest economy in the world. India is the fifth largest economy. Soon, perhaps, it'll become third largest economy. So if in a global situation, when you have such a large two economies who are also democratic, diverse and market economies, there is lot of interest on both sides going ahead, whether it is trade, investment, technology, talent, joint innovation, joint research. So those are the areas where both are very much interested. India, over the last decade or so, if you see our engagement with the European Union itself, but also with countries within Europe, whether they are in Nordics or Baltics, Estonia is here today, but also Central Europe and many other countries, the ties have really intensified, and there is mutual interest for mutual benefit. So we are becoming strategic partners in a true sense. There are shared interests in growth, competitiveness, which can be taken forward through this partnership, whether it is digital transformation, green transition, supply chain resilience. All those factors are of great interest. So from mining to AI, from defense to space, there's a huge collaboration going on across countries and between India and Europe and EU itself. If you take trade in goods, $135 billion, in services, more than $55 billion, the diaspora, so on all fronts, there is huge interest going forward.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanmayji. Christina, let's talk about connectivity projects. And China was a little bit ahead of the game with its Belt and Road Initiative. How can the EU and India catalyze the implementation of connectivity projects that link them more closely as the two partners, but perhaps also link the Indo-Pacific with the Mediterranean? And how can the global gateway be rendered more effective in this regard?
Thank you, Amrita. And I would like to join my fellow panelists in thanking the organizers for this marvelous conference. It's my first time and I'm very impressed. So thank you very much for having us all here. Before I go to the connectivity, I'd like to draw a little bit of a broader line before. My fellow panelists here have already discussed the unique situation Europe is finding itself these days, and we've heard about this in many different metaphors in different sessions over the last couple of days. It's the geopolitical coming of age of Europe. I'd like to call it the emancipation of Europe from the United States. So in a way, which is a little bit of a more positive term rather than, oh God, we're all alone. In this situation, a lot of the coverage, of course, focuses on the security leg of that need for strategic autonomy that Europe now has to master. But there's also another leg, which is the economic leg. And I think even before that shock that, I don't know what moment you would put the re-election of Trump, the Munich Security Conference, or Zelensky in Trump's office, the realization, I think, that it's in Europe's interest to become more independent from the United States, and that means also reaching out to a wider range of friends, of potential partners. We've also heard a lot of times these days, the rising middle power, all that discourse, of course, means that diversification is very high on the agenda, not only for middle powers themselves that are non-aligned, but also for Europe. So I think in that context, reaching out, it's not a coincidence that von der Leyen came with a whole college to India. It's not a coincidence that this happened so fast. It's not a coincidence that she went so fast to South Africa. So there is a really systematic outreach, I think, to these strong middle powers, or even emerging global powers, I would say, to diversify these relationships. Now, connectivity, and I would say there is a momentum for hope. There's a special window for connectivity, particularly, of course, we're talking about IMEC and the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, and a potential reinvigoration of that was hinted at during the Modi's visit in Washington, D.C. Because Trump is very enthusiastic about it, and also because there is hope that some of the reasons that led the project to be paused might be easier to take out of the way. I'm actually quite skeptical about that, but maybe we can come back to that in the second round. But on the opportunity side, yes, the connectivity project the IMEC is a huge geopolitical project that was falsely launched as a counter project to the BRI, which is of course factually isn't, because the BRI is a global project. But of course, this is also in this particular moment a project where Europe and the United States and several regional powers have converging interests in that they want this project to happen for very good reasons, because they can all win from it. Now, you were talking about the implementation, so of course,
very quickly, please.
Yes, very quickly. Just on this, in a nutshell, the main challenges why IMAC was paused a couple of years ago are still there, but I think there's more motivation to make it happen. Yeah, and so we can talk about the specific challenges, the specific if it's establishing norms and standards, or finding financing, or there's tiny problem of creating political stability across the whole path of IMAC. Those things are still there. So there's a lot of challenges ahead, but it's as Modi said also, it's a generational project, so not a short-term undertaking.
Thank you, Christina. Garima, India is a key player in the Indo-Pacific in its own right, but also as a member of the Quad. Where do you see the possible areas of cooperation between the EU and India in this area?
Thank you, Amrita. So for India, the biggest challenge in the Indo-Pacific is obviously China. This has been the lens through which India has viewed many of its partnerships. And India's closest partners today are those with which it shares similar assessments of the China challenge. Most importantly, the Quad countries, United States, Australia, and Japan. Often what we saw as a hindrance for Europe-India ties was that New Delhi was not clear what is Europe's approach to China. We were getting very mixed signals from member states, from European businesses, particularly German companies, for instance, 16+1 and other initiatives. So I think this was a key hindrance that was stopping Europe-India ties from reaching their full potential. Now, this has been very successfully addressed and eliminated with the Commission visit, and I would highlight 3 key things here. First, President von der Leyen very clearly articulated, I've seen the clearest articulation I've ever seen of India's importance to the EU came in this visit, where she mentioned the importance of sharing interests, not just values with India. And I think that's key. Second was in context of the Draghi report of on European competitiveness, it highlighted India as a key partner. And third, as Europe talks about de-risking from China, reducing dependence on China in critical sectors where India wants to move up the value chain. Those sectors were also highlighted. India was clearly positioned as an economic alternative to China. And I think this sort of injects a new wave of sort of enthusiasm in the relationship, but also opens plenty of opportunities to do more together. The Trade and Technology Council, which the EU has with India and the United States, the only 2 partners, is one such example of looking at, similar assessments of China, the incoming China shock, aligning industrial policies. I think the opportunities are endless, but perhaps in the second round, I can dampen my own statement by talking a little bit about challenges. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Garima. Minister Leyen, we would love to hear from you about the FTA. An very ambitious deadline has been set. Another ambitious deadline has also been set in the context of New Zealand and India. But the EU-India negotiations in this very important area have been prone to deadlock. What are the reasons for this persistent deadlock, and why do you think they can be overcome by the end of this year?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very hopeful that this set deadline by the end of the year can actually be reached. We have seen a strong political commitment to these negotiations. We've had now a round of negotiations actually taking place that also leave me quite hopeful. And I think in the current geopolitical climate, it has become more and more important to reach these kind of trade agreements so that our economies can strive. I think that's a realization now that sort of on both sides have really sunk in, I think. And therefore, I think this has actually facilitated the conditions for an agreement. And as I said before, I think particularly in this field that we talked about, clean tech, for instance, it is very much in the interest both of India as well as of the EU to collaborate further. And I'd very much like to see this develop there.
But Minister Luhmann, clearly there are reasons to cooperate, but maybe tell us a little bit about what were the hurdles, perhaps. So, and a couple.
Well, I mean, that's always if you amplify the hurdles that might have been there in the past, it might also turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy of these hurdles remaining here in the future. I think we really, with the visit of the college and this commitment to this agreement, I think we have really seen a more open stage for these kind of negotiations, and therefore I think we need to approach the hurdles that were there in the past now with a fresh mind and really with a commitment set on actually reaching an agreement. Because as a politician, you can always find an excuse for not making an agreement. But if we understand that it's in both our interests, then I think we can reach it, and therefore I'm very hopeful.
Thank you very much. We're still getting good positive vibes here. Let me turn to you, Secretary Seyfiov, and ask you about continuing the conversation on the FTA, how are the two going to agree on questions of environmental and labor standards, for instance? And what about key areas such as automobile market access?
Obviously very good questions, but asked not from the right person. As you're well aware, perhaps not, member states have delegated these negotiating powers to the European Commission. Now, I'm representing a member state. I can tell you from Estonia's perspective, we are an ambitious country. We are a country that does not listen patiently to those who keep telling us that things are not doable because they were not doable last year or yesterday. Remember, back in 1990, many argued that our re-emergence on the map of the world was an aspirational goal. Or perhaps in 1991, after we had regained our independence, they told us that it was aspirational to expect the Russians to withdraw their troops from Estonia. And yet in 1994, thanks to overwhelming international pressure, they went. And 10 years later, we joined NATO and the European Union. Now, the world is in a period of upheaval. Usually during stable periods, nuances can change, much can be achieved, but only with enormous effort. During periods of upheaval, decades happen during weeks. The negatives are all so obvious. If we manage to somehow get to an outcome in Ukraine where the most basic of international principles are thrown out the window, then we would be opening a Pandora's box, the negative effects of which would be felt not just in Europe, perhaps not even primarily in Europe, but around the world. The effects on territorial integrity, for instance. Consider the borders around the world. I mean, they derive their legitimacy, most of them, from the fact that they are internationally recognized. We throw this out the window, what do we have? So the negatives are clearly there, but so are the positives. The EU-India trade relationship is perhaps one of those examples. So again, I can only refer back to what my colleague already referred to. The fact that the EU Commission President travels internationally is not in of itself newsworthy. The fact that different commissions travel internationally is not in of itself newsworthy. The fact that she took the whole commission here is newsworthy. So I would interpret this as the EU Commission meaning business. Now, it always takes two to tango. Trade issues aren't easy to solve. They relate to very, very complex and often very politically loaded questions that are important, especially in democracies. But the ambition on the EU side is certainly there. I personally am a fan of setting ambitious deadlines. We will all be able to come back next year. I mean, depending on whether I'm invited, but most of you will be back next year. And you can have a look back at whether or not this goal was met. The only thing in international politics that matters are not the elegant speeches, not the goals set, but the actual results achieved. We need to hold ourselves accountable and keep the results in focus.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Safeoff. Tanmay-ji, we take a look at various statements, declarations that come over time between India and together, joint declarations, EU and India. And it's very obvious that the two partners are committed to multilateralism, a rules-based order, pluralism. What are the points of difference, especially when we think about India's reformist agenda for multilateral institutions?
Well, it's clear that multilateralism is essential. Today, the nature of interconnectedness and interdependence, it leaves no other option. There are global challenges and there have to be global solutions. And multilateralism has also led to a series of positive outcomes over the past several decades, although it has had challenges. But today, especially, we are faced with very difficult situations, whether it is peace and security, climate, global health, counterterrorism, any number of core issues of core concern to all of us, or the new areas, for example, plastics pollution or BBNJ. There, we find that the progress is not so encouraging and the system is perhaps not as fair. And that brings us to the core difficulty, because multilateralism does require a collaborative spirit. But if we see competitive tendencies being overwhelmingly driving the negotiating positions, then it is very difficult to get a equitable or a fair solution which is in larger interests. So that has remained perhaps one of the challenges. There have been very important treaties and agreements in the past which have, for example, the Montreal Protocol, which are cited as among the very successful examples of multilateralism, which took into account different different partners in the negotiations come from very different spaces. The development stages, the capacities, the resources, the aspirations, the road ahead is very different for different partners. So as long as we can understand that in a negotiating arena, I think we can find very good solutions which are fair, equitable, just. There are also other models of multilateral or collaborative action going on in terms of various, for instance, Climate Action Coalition of Lead It, which is the leadership group for industry transition, includes both member states and also companies, private sector, very big industrial players. So they also show sometimes the model of how we can get real action done in a true collaborative spirit, which is also in mutual interest of all parties concerned. It's not either or. So there are different models available. The current system has its serious difficulties because it was designed to take care of a very different world. And today we have a completely different scenario. So unless the system is delivering for all the partners in an equitable fashion. I think that remains the problem, and it has to be resolved. And I guess today the time probably has finally come when everybody understands that status quo cannot hold, and there would be serious efforts to see what are the best ways possible.
Thank you very much, Tanmay-ji. As we heard from Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar yesterday as well, the system has to be strong, but to be strong, it has to be fair, right? Now, Christina, you started talking about some of the challenges that IMEC is facing already at a broad level. Can you give us some concrete examples of the challenges that we're likely to meet, we'll need to address if we're serious about going forwards with IMEC?
Yes, of course. So I would group the challenges into 3 broad groups. So one is, of course, the geopolitical instability on the way. Second is the financing, and the third is our technical logistical issues. The financing, I think in the initial launch, they talked about 600 billion, of which, to my knowledge, a tiny fraction only has been pledged so far. And at least from the European side, it is easy to imagine how in the present situation when the EU, when all EU states are indebting themselves for generations to draw up a defense of their own, there is little understanding or further leeway to make big pledges to say build a railway on the Arabian Peninsula. So I don't know, but the will is there. Question is who's gonna finance this? And I'm guessing that there is a lot of work going on behind the scenes in order to try to find that out. On the technical side, well, just to give you there's many things. Just to give you an example, so there are many ports involved, right? So you need to make sure that the standards and the ports are the same, so that actually containers fit onto the docking stations and all of those very technical things. And that's not a small thing, because in the old days, you would have expected, for example, in the Mediterranean, everybody has to adapt to our standards. Maybe that's not the way it works with within a project like IMEC. So there needs to be agreement, there needs to be negotiations, and this is all very lengthy. But I think the biggest problem is the persistent geopolitical situation in the Middle East. Although, today I think the ceasefire in Gaza was broken, and there's absolutely no outlook of any kind of lasting stability in Palestine, Israel, and we have to remember that Haifa, the Israeli port of Haifa, is one of the main choke points where IMEC meets the Mediterranean. And also, there's been a lot of changes. Turkey is still mad about not being involved now. And now Turkey, after the fall of Assad, is calling the shots in Syria largely. Also, Turkey has the second biggest army in NATO, and the EU really wants to have Turkey in. So there's a whole set of issues that have changed since the launch of the declaration of IMEC. Again, also Iran is weakened, and nuclear proliferation looms on the horizon. So who wants to invest in a reason like that? So it's a bit of a chicken and egg question. I think the financing is going to be tough. Yeah, and maybe last thing, the normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, that was always dealt as the precondition for real smooth functioning of IMEC is not really yet in the cards. So, until that is the case, it's going to be difficult. But work can start. That's clear.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was very clear. And I would just add to your second point on standards. And harmonization of standards is expensive, so it adds. Where's the financing coming from? With the first point, there's also this problem on the second point. Garima, it would be great if you could address one further issue that's important and that we've not had a chance to address as yet, which is on how can the India and EU Minister Leyen talked very nicely about interests and values, right? Both are important. That's what makes EU and India very strong partners, right? But how can the two safeguard these common interests and values in emerging technology and digital domains? And where do you see the challenges?
I mean, it's a pretty big question, Amrita. I think there are aspects of this that the EU and India are trying to work together on. And I think there are two sort of challenges coming. One from authoritarian regimes. We have, Russia and China on the one hand, their vision of, using technology, the role of state in technology, etc. And then we have a newer challenge coming now from the United States, where big tech is going to play, or is already playing, a role in legislation, in government policy, and both Europe and India have similar challenges emanating from that space. And it will be interesting for both to grapple with this sort of new tendency within the United States. I think within Europe and the EU-US relationship, we'll see these tensions coming. Obviously, on the question of regulation, on the role of these companies, we saw initial tensions already in the Trade and Technology Council. And I think on the US and India front, I mean, we have smoother relations and much stronger ties with the United States. But I think the question of reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, what about US companies that have invested in India and building sort of high-scale manufacturing in India, or what happens to that? Are those companies moving back, and do these open new opportunities for Europe and European companies? And I think there's sort of several strands of looking at it. Of course, we can go the traditional route of what is being discussed in the TTC and digital policy. But I also think that these newer questions would be more interesting, more timely to address. And I think this opens new opportunities for European businesses and companies as well.
Thank you very much. So indeed, some of these challenges are opportunities, as we were discussing earlier. The floor is open for questions. I would request everyone who's asked a question to please ask a question rather than comment, and give your name and your organizational affiliation. The lady at the back there, please.
Thank you for the interesting conversation, Hannah Shelest, Ukrainian Prism. I would like to bring yet one elephant to this room and to ask about the European sanctions against Russia. When Europe is increasing in energy sphere, the India increasing energy cooperation. How this fits the dialogue in terms of the economic and further cooperation between two states?
And who are you addressing the question to?
Who is risky to respond?
I would suggest we collect a couple of questions, please.
Our question to Mr. Tanmaya. We got our CAPA done in almost 80 days, which is one of the swiftest CAPA that was ever been done with any country with UAE. And then we got our ECTA done with almost an year with Australia. But it's been some years now we have been stuck with this process with the FTA agreement with the European Union. What's exactly stopping India? Ms. Amrita asked this question to the European Union counterparts. Let me ask this question to the Indian counterparts. Thank you.
Thank you. That pesky question of the FTA comes back. I want to go to somebody on this side. Please, the gentleman there.
So I would like to follow up on the FTA, because there is obviously, there is the sound of the phase of negotiations, but also there is this, when the deal is done at the end of the year, the parliament and everything needs to be implemented. And I think that's if the negotiations are on the Commission side, I think, the implementation and also needs to be done in the parliament.
What is the
and
question?
My question is how we can assure that after we have been negotiating the deal for 20 years now, that we have this deal as part of our law and that it will be implemented successfully. So whom should we address and how we would like to mobilize our public opinion in favor of this deal? Because we are both democracies.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to give the panel an opportunity to respond to these three sets of questions. Why don't I begin in the opposite direction? Garima, first to you.
Yes, I'll take the question on sanctions and Russia. It's been interesting to see that India's position on Ukraine and close ties with Russia have not upended its relationships with both the EU and member states at all. In fact, on the contrary, it's led to more conversations, more discussions, and an attempt on Europe's part to understand India's history and the reasons for its long ties with Russia. On the question of energy, I mean, I think you've heard this probably several times here, but also repeated generally. I mean, the energy purchase from India is then, the refined oil is then bought by, when you look at where does it go, it ends up in European member states. So this bigger question of sanctions and compliance, I think we are all in it, and there needs to be some soul searching in Europe on this question as well, and you know, the member states and their role in hydrocarbon purchase. On the FTA, I would just like to say that it was interesting to see both leaders agree for this end of year deadline, which is really ambitious and underlines certainly a political will to come to conclusion. And I think it does put pressure on the negotiators. What form the FTA will take, it will certainly not be an early harvest agreement or the kind of agreements we've had with UAE and Australia, qualitatively different from this very broad, wide agreement that the EU likes to negotiate. But I do think that it's interesting to have this end of year deadline. There must be confidence, at least on the political leader side. I do think that puts pressure on the negotiators to come to a conclusion. And the initial signs we've gotten from the European Parliament have actually been very positive.
Okay. Thank you, Garima. Christina, I would request you, if you would like to answer the first or the third question, the second, you're good. Tanmay, that was the FTA question was directed to you. Would you like to answer it?
Well, as was just said, we've recently had the visit of the President of European Commission, and you've seen the leader's statement. There is a very clear direction given to the negotiating teams on both sides. And the deadline is clear. There are very, very regular high-level consultations going on. Even last week, there was a consultation in Brussels. And it is absolutely doable. There is a pragmatism, there is a context, wider geopolitical context also. So it's making both economic logic and geostrategic context. Both sides realize this. And we have to be very optimistic about this. As to why it has not been done so far, you know, the different FTA negotiations are completely different. I mean, the priorities of partners are different. The constraints on them are different. So it'll be difficult to compare any two FTA negotiations with each other. But if you see today, India is talking about FTA finalization not only with EU, but also with US and UK. So there is a very different dynamism right now.
Thank you. Secretary Seyfiov.
So my answer to the third question is an especially simple one. Managing democracy is a tricky proposition. Demonstrating leadership especially so. Yes, obviously any deal negotiated by the Commission needs eventually political support in wider Europe, but that's not news to the European Commission, and that's not news to the Indian government. We're aware of the fact that we are democracies, and that's one of the things that we better have calculated into the promises made. Now, on the challenge of the first question, I was about to grab for the microphone because it was a direct challenge. I am not afraid of addressing this. Look, you know, I'm speaking on behalf of Estonia here. We have now adopted, 16 sanctions packages in the European Union. We're working on the 17th package, not because we've had 16 rounds of good ideas, but because building consensus in democracy takes time. And there are 27 of us, 27 democracies, it takes time. Not perfect. Estonia would have done all 16 in the first week of the war. I think we would have reached a just and lasting peace already had we done that. But that's not realistic. So we keep working. We're working on the 17th. Now, they said sanctions circumvention, either direct or indirect, is obviously a major problem, a major concern. And we do understand that these are European sanctions, not someone else's sanctions. But we also want people to understand, and this is now coming from Estonia, we're a country as far north as Anchorage, Alaska, as northern as they come. We don't use words lightly. For 3 years now, we have described this war as being existential for us, existential. Countries remember. Any one of us can tell stories of who did what when during your war of independence or during your period of hardship, we remember too. We view the world through the prism of this war of aggression. This has an effect, and trust me, when Estonian diplomats do their job around the world, we make sure our interlocutors understand. They have their own calculations, cost-benefit analysis, they have their own reasoning that oftentimes is domestic, oftentimes international, but I assure you, whoever meets an Estonian representative understands that where they come out on the issue of sanctions or on the issue of voting in the General Assembly matters eventually for our bilateral relationship.
Okay, I'd like to add 2 points. First, on the sanction and energy question, I think the broader context here is that we really need to become independent of fossil fuels because they are the lifeline currently still for our economies. We have now made in Germany, we have made a transition that we have now more than 2/3 of our electricity production coming from renewables. So we are not dependent on autocracies exporting us fossils. And I think that's where we need to go so that these kind of things are not as hard on our economies as they currently might be. So renewables is not only an issue that is important for protecting our climate and keeping that secure, but also for our energy security and for being able to face up to challenges coming from autocracies. And second, on the FTA, I think what we need is really on both sides the willingness for compromise and for a really tailored, flexible, and also maybe creative solution. Because as you said before, we are in a historic time period of big changes, of big insecurities. So we also need new and innovative answers to our challenges. If you just say, okay, this was our position for the last 20 years, then we're not going to get out of it. And I think our citizens understand that. I'm just returning from 4 months of campaigning in Germany. And so I've had a lot of interactions with citizens. And one of the main concerns they have actually is this global insecurity and this shift in global alliances and the question mark of what will come also of the transatlantic partnership and all that. So they're looking for new partnerships. They're looking for new ways of ensuring our wealth through trading, through free trading. And therefore, I think the chances now also of getting support from the European public and hopefully also from the Indian public is quite high because people sense that we need to strengthen our friendships now and our partnerships. And I can only say that the EU has proven to be a reliable partner for India and will continue to do so in the next decades.
Thank you very much. One last question to the gentleman over there. I'd please very quickly identify yourself and keep your question to one sentence or two.
Yeah, I'm Nani from Hertie School, Berlin. My question is to the European colleagues on EU's perceptions of China. So US uses decoupling, EU uses de-risking. Given the transatlantic rift, do you think Europe is going to warm up to China, at least geoeconomically? Yeah.
To the European colleagues.
No, I think we have just had discussions also of China's strategy in the EU and also within the German government, for instance, and this issue of de-risking is very high on the agenda. We approach China as a partner, yes, in issues such as climate, for instance. We have worked well with China at the last COP, climate COP, for instance. So that is also something, where we want to improve, also working together with all our partners. Second, we see it as a systemic rival. Speaking of competition between autocracy and democracy, and also as a competitor. No? And we see we also often say that we need to stop being naive in Europe when unfair subsidies are being used on the Chinese side, for instance, And also we need to protect our critical infrastructure. I think that's very key. Yeah, so I think here this it's a complicated, complex relationship. But I see now in Europe that in particularly of the experiences we've made with Russia in the last years, and he will now say, "We told you so." I think
We told you so.
Yeah. I think the skepticism and the caution is very very high.
Thank you. I think that's the final word. Time's up. Please join me in a round of hearty applause